Hello and welcome to the lab lecture on reductive amination. Okay, so let's imagine that you were asked to convert benzylamine to N-methylbenzylamine. How would you do it? A lot of students would actually think about using benzylamine as a nucleophile and doing a SN2 reaction with methyl bromide or methyl iodide in order to make the N-methylbenzylamine. However, this reaction actually doesn't work well. And that's because amines are nucleophilic enough that they don't stop after one alkylation. They will make N-methylbenzylamine, but they can continue reacting with the methyl bromide or methyl iodide to introduce a second methyl group and even a third methyl group, all the way up to the quaternary ammonium salt. So for this reason, a simple SN2 reaction to make a carbon-nitrogen bond, to, for example, go from a primary amine to a secondary amine, doesn't work well. In practicality, having a mixture, as I've said many times in lecture, if you have me in lecture, it's not advantageous to make a mixture because then you have to separate that mixture, and that can take a lot of effort and be very difficult to do. So instead of that, we're going to use a process called reductive amination. So reductive amination allows us to, for example, convert a primary amine, such as benzylamine, to a secondary amine, such as N-methylbenzylamine. The way it works is instead of treating the benzylamine with an alkyl halide, we're going to treat it with a carbonyl-containing component, and it can either be an aldehyde or a ketone. So for example, because I only want to add one carbon, right, with my additional methyl group, I am going to use methanal, or also known more commonly as formaldehyde. So this first reaction is a reaction you should be familiar with. It is imine formation. To form an imine, we mix an aldehyde or ketone with an amine, specifically a primary amine, and under acidic conditions with an optimal pH of 4 to 5, it forms the carbon-nitrogen double bond, which we call an imine. It also forms water, and this is a reversible reaction. However, there's a driving force to continue because under acidic conditions, the nitrogen of the imine can be protonated. When it's protonated, we call it an aminium ion. And if there's a suitable reducing agent present in the solution, the carbon that's double bonded to the positively charged nitrogen will be reduced. This carbon is very electrophilic, just like any carbon that's double bonded to a positively charged oxygen would be considered a strong electrophile. It is also strongly electrophilic when it's double bonded to a nitrogen that's positively charged. So as a result of this carbon being very electrophilic, it can react with strong nucleophiles, such as a hydride from a reducing agent. It is commonly we use sodium cyanoborohydride instead of sodium borohydride or lithium aluminum hydride for reasons that we're going to talk about. But the sodium cyanoborohydride will donate one of its hydrides to the carbon in a nucleophilic attack. Electrons will flow up to the nitrogen, leaving a neutral secondary amine, which we can isolate. This reaction is ideal because while SN2 alkylation can happen multiple times on an amine, imines only form once between a given amine and a carbonyl compound. Once it's formed, it can then be reduced in situ in the reaction pot using a reducing agent that can reduce the aminium ion. So because we're able to stop the alkylation with only adding one alkyl group, this is a much more controlled manner of forming carbon-nitrogen bonds. Let's talk a little bit more about the reducing agent, sodium cyanoborohydride. What does it look like? Well, it looks very similar to sodium borohydride, where one of the hydrides has been replaced with a cyano group. What does the cyano group do to the overall reactivity of the borohydride? Well, as you know, cyano groups are electron withdrawing groups. So it's actually pulling electron density away from the boron, helping to stabilize the negative charge. So sodium cyanoborohydride is actually slightly less reactive as a hydride reducing agent because it's a slightly more stabilized borohydride reducing agent. As a result of it being a little less reactive, it can be more selective. And in this case, it is selective for iminium ions, which is going to be crucial for the reaction. Because note, what did we have to add to form the iminium ion? We have to add an aldehyde or ketone and an amine. But aldehydes and ketones are reactive towards reduction. And if we had used sodium borohydride, the sodium borohydride is reactive enough to reduce aldehydes or ketones, which we don't want. We want the aldehyde or ketone to survive in order to form an imine, and eventually an iminium ion. And then only once that iminium ion is formed, do we want the reduction to occur. We're actually going to use a slightly more selective, slightly less reactive sodium cyanoborohydride instead of sodium borohydride. Alternatively, you could also do a hydrogenation, and that would also reduce the carbon-nitrogen double bond. Let's look at the process again. Recall that aldehydes or ketones are required to form iminium ions. If we had used sodium borohydride, it's possible that some of our aldehyde or ketone would be reduced to an alcohol. We want to avoid that. So instead, we will mix the aldehyde or ketone with an amine, primary amine. Again, at a slightly acidic pH is ideal for this reaction. It will form an imine. The imine will become protonated to form the iminium ion. And then the iminium ion is electrophilic enough to react with the sodium cyanoborohydride. So note that sodium cyanoborohydride is not a strong enough reducing agent to reduce an aldehyde or ketone. However, it is a strong enough reducing agent to reduce an iminium ion because the nitrogen makes this carbon more electrophilic when it's protonated. So it doesn't reduce imines, but it will reduce an iminium ion, which has a more electrophilic carbon due to the positively charged nitrogen. After the reduction, we have made a new carbon-nitrogen bond and essentially alkylated this nitrogen one time. Note that if you do use sodium cyanoborohydride, you must use the reagent under a fume hood because strongly acidic conditions can cause the highly toxic hydrogen cyanide gas to form, and you would want to protect yourself from breathing that in. So can we add more than just a methyl group to a nitrogen atom? And the answer is yes. Reductive amination is very versatile. We can make or add a lot of different alkyl groups. We're going to look at some examples. So for example, if you wanted to just add one carbon, right, in the form of a methyl group, you would use methanal or formaldehyde. If you want to, for example, add an ethyl group, now we need to use a 2-carbon aldehyde in order to have that added. So we need to use ethanal, also known as acetaldehyde. If you want to add a propyl group, you can do that. You just need a 3-carbon aldehyde. So for example, you can use propanal. This is also known as propionaldehyde, as its common name. What about a benzyl group? You can do that with benzaldehyde as your aldehyde. And we can easily add a benzyl group. Now note that it's not easy to add a phenyl group. The reason is we need to have at least one hydrogen here in order to be able to form this carbon-nitrogen bond. And that's because remember that that hydrogen is added through a hydride from sodium cyanoborohydride. So this carbon needs to have at least one hydrogen in order to be able to make this carbon-nitrogen bond. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to reduce an iminium ion formant. With a phenyl group, the carbon directly attached to the nitrogen is sp2 hybridized. Notice there are not any hydrogens here. So this bond, this carbon-nitrogen bond, would not be able to be formed through a reductive amination. You can also use ketones in place of an aldehyde. When you use a ketone, you end up with a branched alkyl group, right? Branched at the carbon that has been attached or bonded to the nitrogen atom. Notice that the carbon still has one hydride, right, delivered by the sodium cyanoborohydride. Let's look at a sequential reductive amination. You can actually do multiple reductive aminations. For example, from a primary amine, you can do one reductive amination to get to a secondary amine, and then you can further do a second reductive amination to get all the way to a tertiary amine. For example, if you were to take this 3-carbon amine, right, known as propanamine, and react it with acetone, it will form an imine, such as this one, or exactly this one. Of course, this would be protonated under the acidic conditions to form the iminium ion. Then this carbon-nitrogen bond would be reduced, and we would end up with N-isopropyl propanamine. From here, we could further react the secondary amine with, for example, benzaldehyde. A reductive amination with benzaldehyde would produce a tertiary amine where we've added this N-benzyl group. And note that if we had reversed this order and instead added the benzyl group first, followed by the isopropyl group, that would be completely fine. So there is no need to add one alkyl group before the other. They would both have worked out just fine. Let's talk about an intramolecular reductive amination. These tend to give students a bit of trouble because it's a little bit harder to imagine the formation of a ring. But if you have a molecule that has both an amine, primary amine, and a carbonyl, for example, this ketone, then the amine and the ketone can react together to form an imine under acidic conditions. That imine would be protonated to form the iminium ion, and the carbon-nitrogen bond would be reduced, thereby forming the 6-membered ring with a nitrogen atom. So we form the cyclic amine. I highly recommend that when you are thinking about drawing the product of a reductive amination, to go ahead and count or label your carbons. You could even extend a number to the nitrogen if you wanted, so that you can imagine the atoms involved in the bond formation. So for example, the first step would be to combine carbon number 2 using a double bond to this nitrogen atom. And that tells me, since I'm starting here, we have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-membered ring being formed. Let's think about doing a retrosynthetic analysis, which means working backwards to plan a reductive amination. For example, if you were thinking about preparing this tertiary amine through a reductive amination, there's actually 3 retrosynthetic pathways that are available to you. You can make either of these 3 different carbon-nitrogen bonds. And the reason I know you can make all of them through a reductive amination is because I'm looking at these alpha carbons, and they all have at least one hydrogen attached to them, which means that we can make this through a reductive amination. In addition, they're all sp3 hybridized, which is a requirement when we're doing a reductive amination. So retrosynthetically, if we think about making the nitrogen-carbon bond between carbon A, we're going to break this bond. And that means that this part on the right was the amine, and we need to add a carbonyl between carbon A and an oxygen that is no longer there. Right? So thinking backwards, we can think, okay, this used to be a double bond, hence this iminium ion, and then that separates to a secondary amine and cyclohexanone. We can also make the bond between carbon B and nitrogen. Working backwards, we could put a double bond here, getting to the iminium ion, and then that retrosynthetically, we break this carbon-nitrogen double bond into the secondary amine, and in this case, acetone. How about the bond between carbon C and nitrogen? We can also make that bond. And working backwards, we could imagine a double bond between this carbon and nitrogen to reveal this iminium ion, which then if we break this carbon-nitrogen double bond, we get a different secondary amine, and in this case, propanol. So all of these bonds are possible to form through a reductive amination. And we know that because the carbons attached are all sp3, and there's at least one hydrogen attached to them, which means that we will be able to form an iminium ion and then deliver that hydrogen through a hydride attack on that aminium ion. So again, note that if the carbon is sp2 and does not contain or does not contain a hydrogen attached, we will not be able to make this carbon-nitrogen bond via a reductive amination. We would have to use a different reaction, which we haven't learned, in order to make this carbon-nitrogen bond. So for now, it's important that you just recognize that we can't make it through a reductive amination. If you think about working backwards, right, we are not able to generate an iminium ion here and reduce that iminium ion through hydride nucleophilic attack, because again, that would end up with a hydrogen here, which we don't see. Okay, it's time to test yourself. I've put up some practice problems here, and I would like you to pause the video and try to fill in the missing blanks here, right, or the missing structures, product, reactant, or reagent. Draw the product of this intramolecular reductive amination, and do this sequential reductive amination to end up with a tertiary amine. So go ahead and pause, do your best, and then we'll continue the video. Okay, time to see if you got the right answers. So did you connect the carbon of the carbonyl to this nitrogen using a double bond, right, which would have given you the imine, the carbon-nitrogen double bond here, protonate it to form an iminium ion, and then imagine the reduction of that to give a secondary amine. In this case, we were given the product and the secondary amine, but we were not given the starting material. So working backwards, we can see what secondary amine was used. So we made this carbon-nitrogen bond. So imagine this was an iminium ion, and then retrosynthetically cleave that carbon-nitrogen double bond to reveal secondary amine in this case, and a carbonyl here, which would have made a ketone, right, or 2-methyl cyclohexanone. In this case, we were given the starting ketone and the amine product. So we can see that we made this carbon-nitrogen bond. So we just needed to take this part off, which is the amine. That was the reagent used in this case. So cyclopropylamine as the amine in this reductive amination. Moving on to the intramolecular reductive amination. Right? Hopefully you did some sort of numbering to figure out what size ring you're going to form. If you started counting here, this makes a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 member ring with the nitrogen atom as part of the ring. We can form a 5-membered ring where we form a double bond between what's labeled as carbon number 1 with this black dot and the nitrogen. That gives us an iminium ion that will be reduced to sodium cyanoborohydride. The last question was a sequential reductive amination. First, this primary amine was treated with ethanol, which will introduce an ethyl group on the nitrogen. Then they used formaldehyde or methanol, which ends up adding a methyl group to the nitrogen. We went from primary amine to secondary amine to tertiary amine. If the order of the reactions was reversed, B would be the same, but A would differ. Basically, the product ends up as the same, but the intermediate would be different because we've added the, and oops, there is a typo here. This should be formaldehyde, not acetone. So this structure up here should appear down here. So if we're introducing the methyl group, we need to use formaldehyde or methanol first, right? And we would end up with, instead of an N-ethyl group, we would end up with an N-methyl group, and then the N-ethyl group gets added second. In this experiment, it's a little bit different because they are not using sodium cyanoborohydride, which is, by the way, what the Klein book uses for their reductive aminations. Instead, they're using a safer alternative. Remember the mention of the possible formation of hydrogen cyanide gas, which is toxic. So in order to use something a little bit safer, the chemists in the video use sodium triacetoxyborohydride, which can be used in place of sodium cyanoborohydride. So the specific reaction that was performed in the video is benzylamine being treated with either methyl or ethyl pyruvate. Pyruvate contains both a ketone and an ester. Recall that ketones are much more electrophilic than esters, so it makes sense that the carbon-nitrogen double bond or the imine will form with the ketone and not with the ester. We are achieving acidic conditions with the use of acetic acid. So they've drawn the protonated iminium ion, which then gets reduced by the reducing agent sodium triacetoxyborohydride, and we end up with the new carbon-nitrogen bond. And this just is a nice picture showing you all the different possible hydride reducing agents. This is the one that's being used, sodium triacetoxyborohydride. And all of the rest of them are different hydride reducing agents. Lithium aluminum hydride and sodium borohydride, you're probably the most familiar with. Remember that those are not used because those could potentially reduce the ketone, giving a side product or byproduct that we don't want. In addition, lithium aluminum hydride could also reduce the ester in the methyl or ethyl pyruvate, which would be, again, an undesired reaction. And sodium cyanoborohydride is another alternative that would also work in this reaction, except for the fact that it isn't used due to the potential toxicity and the fact that it's students and not professional chemists running the reaction. Okay. Hopefully that makes you a little bit more confident with what a reductive amination is and when it's useful. And I hope to see you guys in office hours.